everyone. Welcome to Chapter 4, which is all about folk and popular culture. So today we're going to talk about what folk and popular culture are and how they spread or are diffused. And so here's a picture of some indigenous people in Argentina that are selling kind of their handicrafts and clothing. And what I want to point out in this picture is despite the fact that they're selling this traditional clothing that is part of their folk culture, they are wearing Western clothes. And so we're going to talk also about that intersection of folk and popular culture. And so when we talk about folk and popular culture, right, we're talking about material culture often. And this is our outward sensible manifestations of culture. And what do I mean by that? I mean things like clothing, right? So here is the former president of Zambia who has passed away, but here he is wearing a Western suit. Food. This is a picture in South Africa of people making something called smileys. And smileys are where you cook an animal head and you take kind of the cheek and meat, and they're called smileys because the animal looks like it's smiling when it's cooking. So like, why is that a traditional food there? Architecture. Here's a building. This building could almost possibly be anywhere. Right, this kind of non-distinct architecture. Some places have very specific architecture. And then art, either music or visual. Here is a Native American totem, etc., etc., etc. Right, so those are the most popular ones: clothing, food, architecture, art. We could also talk about in terms of language. But folk is something that is shared by a few people, and popular is something that is shared by many. So, for example, this suit is part of popular culture. Countries all over the world, despite they might still have some type of traditional dress, right? You can find men wearing suits like this in just about every place in the world, right? This is part of folk culture, right? This very specific dish, these smileys, you can really only, for the most part, find this shared amongst, in South Africa, amongst these people, and possibly their diaspora. So if these people migrate to someplace else. And to go back to that question, why are they cooking the head? Because this very often communities that might have had restricted access to food or that were poor, right, would use kind of undesirable parts of the animal to make quite delicious things. This is popular culture. This building, right, this style of building, again, is ubiquitous. And the totem pole would be an example of folk culture, right? This, while you may be able to recognize this, understanding it and having it be part of your culture is only shared by a few. And so, again, when we talk about folk culture, it is small scale. And there is slow diffusion, right? It is slow to move from one place to the next. It is shared by a smaller group of people. It diffuses by relocation. So if somebody from that folk culture area gets up and moves to someplace else, they will take that with them. It is often, but not entirely, isolated and rural. So we look at this kind of rural village in India, or this hill tribe village in northern Thailand, which is a Hmong tribe. They're not super isolated. They're right kind of up the hill from Chiang Mai, but they are, which is a more major city. But they are certainly more rural. They are internally homogeneous for the most part. And what I mean by internally homogeneous is that a lot of people who practice this folk culture, right, you have a similar ethnic group or a bunch of people who are together that have a lot in common and not a ton of diversity within that group. They are often considered more traditional as well. So, you know, a lot of people will point in the U.S. to the Amish, right, as being an example of folk culture. They're a smaller community. Their practices don't really diffuse outside of that community. They are considered more traditional. And they have a lot of these customs and cultures and clothing and everything else has a practical and productive you know, reason by it. So often adapting to the environment, to where it comes from, but also, you know, like I said before, with the that example of food, those smileys, right? Those people are adapting to the food that was available to them. It's often indigenous. It doesn't have to be indigenous. Amish is not indigenous, but people who are indigenous to an area will often kind of practice folk culture. So again, we can have indigenous and non-indigenous folk culture and kind of a mix of the two. Indigenous culture could be thought of as native culture, such as Native Americans in the United States. And so here's a picture of Miss Navajo Nation from 2010. They are usually separate from the more dominant ethnic group. Often they're first, but not always. So in Canada, Native Americans are called First Peoples. In Australia, there are Aboriginal Australians, people who were there before Europeans got there. They are universally marginalized, unfortunately. So across Latin America, North America, and Australia, and definitely is in the case in a lot of places of sub-Saharan Africa. These are places where these people are smaller groups, often have had land taken away from them, and are marginalized in society. Then we have non-indigenous folk culture, which is again these more traditional lifestyles like the Pennsylvania Amish. And they kind of run parallel but separate from indigenous and pop culture. So, Pennsylvania Amish certainly interact with Western culture. They live adjacent to Western culture. You can go visit an Amish market, but they are, like I said, just running parallel to it. And they're often religious based, right? So whether this is the Pennsylvania Amish or Orthodox Jewish, this tradition is based in a religion. Examples: Amish, Mennonite, Orthodox Jews. Popular culture has mass appeal, and it is large scale. It usually travels by expansion diffusion, so starts in a hearth and moves its way out. For example, the example I'll talk about is hip hop, but you have basketball being played in Hong Kong, Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills, right? Fashion kind of making its way out from California to other places. Usually starts in urban centers. And is adaptable. So very often with popular culture, you take something like hip hop and it spreads around the world, and each kind of culture adapts it a little bit. So it's heterogeneous, right? It's very kind of, it's not homogeneous, right? It's more diverse. Often around leisure and consumption, these things are spreading. So things like music and basketball or the purchasing of clothing. Often it evolved from folk culture in some way. So we'll look at some examples of that, but we often have a lot of times where you have something that was practiced by a small group of people, it spread, it was modified in order to get some type of mass appeal, and then it becomes large scale. The last thing I'm going to talk about in this lecture is cultural appropriation as well, and what that is. So when we look at in terms of music, when we have folk culture and music, we have an oral history. This includes technical information that you need to know how you need to do things. And then this kind of universal language where there's some similarities. And then in popular culture, you have these universal themes where you have these styles rooted in place. These hearths, for example, New York, hip hop, jazz from New Orleans, blues from Memphis, country music from Nashville, which country music is popular in a lot of places around the world. Some country music is extraordinarily popular in sub-Saharan Africa, which a lot of people don't know about, but kind of these universal themes of, very often country western songs are talking about love or heartache. Or London and New York were kind of the birth of punk music. So you can see how these types of music have just kind of diffused by expansion around the globe. This is also true with sports. Sports and folk cultures are often kind of tests of a necessary skill. There is a really interesting kind of very old documentary out there, which I'm not going to have you watch, called Trobriander Cricket, which is about these indigenous people in Papua New Guinea who learned cricket and very much modified it it almost looks like an entirely different game now, but it's kind of been a test of skill for men and kind of some ways taken place of kind of more violent competition. Popular sports often evolving from folk sports, and they diffused with migration and colonization especially, and they kind of replaced a lot of these tribal practices. So things about like soccer, which the World Cup is going on right now when I recorded this lecture. It might not be going on when you listen to it, but it's going on right now. Soccer is truly a global sport. The United States, it's showing here, we are the only people who like do not massively care about it. For a variety of reasons, but if you look at like the popularity of soccer across the globe, and one of the reasons why soccer spread so far so fast is because unlike a lot of other sports, you can play soccer with, you can make a ball out of just about anything, a bunch of rags and bind them together and make a goal out of just about anything and play soccer. So unlike American football or baseball or basketball, there's not a lot of specialized equipment that you need in order to play soccer. You can play soccer quite easily. And then we think about clothing. Folk culture has a lot of geographic variation. So if you look at in Arabia, these men's white clothing versus Inuits in Canada wearing quite different clothing. Some of it is based upon like social norms and taboos and status. A lot of it has to do with environmental functionality, right? It is very warm in Arabia, so covering your skin, wearing white helps with that. It is very cold in northern Canada, right? So you're going to have traditional clothing that is designed to keep you warm. Popular clothing tends to change a lot through time. It has a lot of temporal variation, especially what is trendy, what is in right now. Most folk cultures have adopted some type of Western clothing. And so I showed you that picture in the beginning as well. So we might have our traditional clothing, but in our day-to-day lives, we're still wearing Western clothing. When we think about food, it has this connection with its place, this terroir, right? So kind of what's available there to eat, what kind of practices are available to you cooking. What are your food storage systems looking like? Did you have refrigeration? Did you not? This is Ethiopian kitfo, which is a very spicy raw beef that is cooked, served with injera, which if you've never had Ethiopian food, go have it. It's delicious. You can get really good Ethiopian food in San Diego. But this injera, this flat bread, is made with teff, which is this grass that is native to Ethiopia. So constrained by cookability, like what is how are you cooking? What do you have available to you? A lot of foods eaten out of necessity, such as these little fishy snacks in Taiwan. There are many taboos, some that are practical, some that are not. So the idea of, pigs being thought of as an unclean animal, and so a lot of cultures and religion not eating pig. And then we have popular food culture, where you have cuisines that are rooted in a place, often derived from folk food. So here we have a taco shop in South Korea. And so globalization is quickly spreading ethnic cuisines. A lot of these are thought of as like non-authentic, and it would be good if you took some time and thought about what I mean by authentic. Authentic is kind of this very weird word that we use to describe food. If we go to P.F. Chang's, we might not be like, that's authentic Chinese food, as opposed to if we go to eat Chinese food in Chinatown in San Francisco. But very often these things that are this popular food culture, right? If you think about what Taco Bell looks like versus what food at your local taco shop look like, it looks very different. But they're spread by migration as well. And food is kind of an experience, right? So people traveling to other places, they want to experience something kind of food related. They're able to do that with that food from someplace else. Also, if you have a lot of people from one culture moving to the next, that food is going to become pretty popular. And so if we look at like sandwiches across the United States, which I like this, sandwiches can tell you a story, right? We have different types of sandwiches, which you can find all over the world. Lobster roll in New England. I grew up in New England, ate a lot of lobster rolls. That's generally something that you're not going to find too much of in Southern California. You can occasionally, but lobsters are pretty prevalent in New England and Maine, and especially in the summer. It's this hot lobster roll. The hot lobster roll has butter on it. The cold one has mayonnaise on it. Don't ever get the cold one. That is a very regional thing, by the way, as well, which if you took my geography of food class, which I used to teach at San Diego State, I would talk about the lobster roll for quite some time. But, right, that's a regional sandwich. As you look at pulled pork in the Southeast, where you have this tradition of barbecue, Italian beef in Chicago, lots of kind of history of cattle butchery in Chicago, the po' boy in Louisiana, which is cooking shrimp, right? You're near the water, versus the carne asada torta with avocado in California, right? You have this Mexican influence, and then the avocado, which we are all about in California. Beer. Beer is food. Which I do not mean that when somebody says you should eat something and you're like, I've had a beer, that's food. Don't say that. That's not what I mean. But, beer is something that we consume. And it has these weird accidental folk origins. So way back when, people had these granaries. Not that some people don't still have granaries today, but basically you had these storage of grain for when it was not harvest season, and some water would get in there. And then as people got down to the bottom of the grain, there was this kind of slushy, watery mix at the bottom, and because out of necessity, they're like, we're gonna eat or drink that, and then they were like, hey, I feel pretty good after doing that. Also, beer was very popular for a long time, hundreds of years ago, because you could store beer on a ship and you didn't have to worry about it going bad. So again, you had these wet grain sprouts that then fermented, so you kind of, the accidental discovering of beer. It's now globally popular. Most of that is based upon European styles. PBR, Schlitz, Coors Light, it's everywhere. And then there's regional preferences based upon climate and grains, right? So we have Asahi, right? Different type of beer, but they're all kind of these light lageries in general. And then you kind of have this more traditional type of fermented alcohol. But beer is near ubiquitous. There's no beer in countries where you have kind of more strict laws about alcohol, and then also just cultural reasons why that would not spread. It is widely exported. It is pretty homogenous. You can get a lager just about anywhere in the world that will taste somewhere along the Budweiser, Coors, Miller variety. A lot of geographic imagery is used to brand beer. So this one is called Moose Drool. This is a Karlovačko, which I drank in Croatia, and it's got that checkerboard, which is kind of a symbol of Croatia. Beer from Taiwan. This is one that I got in Utah called Polygamy Porter. So basically people kind of making their own twist on that beer. We can also look at architecture. Right. It is highly visual and a present part of the cultural landscapes. When we think about folk architecture, it's adapted to the environment, right? On the bottom is a salt box house from New England. It uses local materials, right? If that's a thatch roof or an adobe house, often focused around sacred kind of spaces. If we even think about and again, this is probably less of folk culture, but if we even think about, like, what do churches look like? What do different churches look like? What do the missions look like in California? How are they specifically missions? Versus popular, they're sometimes placeless. You can look at, like, again, I showed you that building way back at the beginning of this, where it's kind of like that building could be anywhere, but kind of often rooted in these folk sensibilities. So often we'll try to replicate this more folk culture. These are some popular American housing styles. So, on the top right there, you could see kind of that Spanish style architecture. There is that more kind of bungalow at the bottom. This type of architecture here, this is much more common in the Midwest and in the Northeast. These types of houses, you don't really see these in Southern California very often. There are some sustainability issues in folk cultures, and I'll talk about that in folk cultures and also in popular cultures. Basically, in folk cultures, sometimes folk cultures have trouble preserving because there is some type of pressure coming from popular culture. Popular culture being ubiquitous and kind of everywhere, people may feel pressured, but also not just pressured in a ways of like the younger people want to use the popular culture, but if you think about, there's a picture here of kind of clear cutting in the Brazilian Amazon, which you have an economic opportunity there, right? So rather than practicing your kind of traditional methods of subsistence in the Amazon, in order to kind of make money, and often you've been kicked off of your lands, right? There might be some types of clear cutting, so we're going to make money by clearing the forest as opposed to using it. Also, telecommunications, right? The internet is available just about anywhere now, and so there's a lot more exposure to popular culture. And sometimes we have, traditional values at odds with modern morals. And this is a culture war that is going on around the world and including in the US. I'm sure some of you have heard people who are older than you, or if you are older than some people like I am, kind of complaining about kind of the youth today and how they're not sticking to kind of these traditional values. Popular culture is popular for a reason, right? It is spread rapidly, especially with the dawn of the internet, and it has somewhat of a universal appeal. Some responses to sustainability issues in folk cultures, by folk and popular cultures, is things like activism for sovereignty and recognition, right? So a lot of tribes fighting for their land, fighting for the right to practice their traditional practices. Things like this is a traditional Hawaiian fish pond in Hawaii. Native Hawaiians have a long and proud history with fishing. And then indigenous people being seen as environmental stewards, right? So taking back ownership of their landscapes and their land. This is using something called local or traditional ecological knowledge. And then cultural or ecotourism. Here is an ad from Australia, Aboriginal Australia, natural wonders, culturally rich. Right, so even in the United States, you have Native American nations like the Navajo, who there are really high rates of poverty on reservations, and so often kind of encouraging some type of tourism onto the reservation as a source of income. And so I want to just point out that, tribes are isolated around the world, indigenous tribes often, but they are not always, but often, but they are not disconnected. This is in Brazil, right? This is not the case where people are living this traditional indigenous lifestyle kind of off in the middle of nowhere and have no idea what's going on, right? They are very connected to the modern world. They are very knowledgeable about it, and they are participating in it. And then some sustainability issues in popular culture, issues with uniformity. You're going to have a question about uniform culture for your last exercise for this. But, the idea of this homogeneous, everything looking the same everywhere, it can inhibit innovation, right? We, especially Americans, get very attached to kind of having everything the same everywhere in some cases. And so that kind of prevents change and innovation. And then we also have environmental and health problems. The Western diet is pretty unhealthy in general compared to a lot of more traditional diets. Lifestyle choices like spending half of the time watching TV, things like pollution from high levels of consumption, and resource depletion, right? These economies in popular culture depend upon consumption. So, you having the latest clothing trends depends upon you buying the latest clothing and therefore getting rid of your current clothing. And some of responses to sustainability issues in popular culture, one is valuing diversity, right? So looking at your food landscape or your clothing landscape and going, okay, it's good to have a level of diversity there. That brings us some value. Also kind of awareness and action, whether that's environmental, recycling rates, being more socially conscious about what we purchase and consume, and then also, economic, so not spending such a large portion of our income on consumption. So health and environmental consciousness. These are hard to combat. Something called cultural inertia. There's usually like a breaking point where a culture will be able to switch over and do something. So if we look at national recycling rates here, right, it was pretty low, it was pretty low, it was pretty low, and then all of a sudden it kind of took off, right? It's now, you know, pretty socially popular for people to recycle, and it's kind of, you know, looked down upon if you're not recycling. And then also vested financial interests, right? Who is making money off of this consumption, and how is that hard to change, right? So if you look at something like the dollar menu, right, that again, that is hard to switch, right? That is the dollar, the way that food is produced is not very environmentally sustainable. It's not very good for you. But you know, it's very inexpensive, right, to feed a family at McDonald's. The last thing that I want to talk about and just mention is cultural appropriation, which your book does not really get into. But people might have heard of the idea of cultural appropriation in the news. And cultural appropriation is the act of taking or using things from a culture that is not your own, especially without showing that you understand or respect this culture. This is something that usually it's a one direction. So you take something from a marginalized culture and you use it for yourself. There has been a lot, especially around Native American culture. This is a fashion show from a few years ago that took a lot of flack for cultural appropriation, right? This is a comic here. It says, "I'm honoring you," and says, no, this is actually just kind of offensive. So wearing this sacred ceremonial headdress and using it in this fashion is considered very often to be very offensive. This also occurs around Halloween costumes, African American hairstyles that are then co-opted by white celebrities is often described as cultural appropriation. So I encourage you to read a little bit more about that and learn a little bit more about cultural appropriation. That's the end of chapter 4. You're going to proceed on to your last exercise.